What happened?
I'll tell you in a minute. I have to do this before each of these.
Okay, we are live.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're going to be talking to Beatriz Williams about the beach at Summerley, which involves Cold War espionage. So I am actually wearing a thing I bought in St. Petersburg, Russia, which I thought is sort of beachy, right? But I thought it would be appropriate as this kind of beachy kind of cover-up
and
thing.
Russian,
Russian, right?
My grandfather was born in St. Petersburg and had to flee during the revolution. So yes, that is personal.
And to go with it, I have this tasteful cast because I had hand surgery on Monday, and I have to hold up my hand higher than my heart until July 10th. So
how are you going to do that and sleep?
Well, they give you this blue foam thing that you has a flat bottom, and you have to put your arm into it, and then there you are. Who knew?
Oh my gosh.
I know. But anyway, it's just an artifact of getting older that arthritis strikes, and then you have to fix it. So
I'm so sorry.
No, it's it's okay. I had it on Monday morning, and because the surgeon originally was going to do it on June 27th, but decided to go on vacation, he did this Monday morning, and Monday night I launched Steve Perry. So,
So how many meds are you on, Barbara? Should I,
fewer than I
watch the questions here and make sure that they're all appropriate?
I've gone all day without any, but Patrick will tell you I look pretty stoned last couple, and I was. But anyway, I don't need to be stoned to tell you.
It makes for a more fun discussion, I always feel.
Right. If I falter, you will know. Anyway, the beach at Summerley is really a lot of fun. But let me mention at the outset that we have autographed copies that Beatriz has kindly signed for us and should be with us anytime. And Patrick will be putting a buy link into the comments field while we're talking. So if you'd like to order one, you can do that. Usually Beatriz comes to see us despite she has a high tolerance for heat, unlike many authors.
I'm a trooper. I have a British father, and it was very much never complain, never explain. So, I just go where they tell me.
Well, you've been really good about coming out here in the heat all these years, but this year is sort of more appropriate for your book that you're doing mostly an East Coast tour. So
yes. Anyway,
Zoom saves us from being deprived of Beatriz entirely. So all that is very good news.
What would be summer without Beatriz?
That's right. No, it's really true. And in fact, summer, I was looking back, manages to work its way into a number of your titles, doesn't it?
Well, yes, that's actually part of the lore of this book. So if you want to ask me about the title, I will tell you the story of the title maybe after we go through the meat and bones of the story here.
Well, no, I think you should. And also we're referring back to a location in an earlier book, The Summer Wives. So why not tell us about that now?
Yeah, so I do have a bit of a split personality as a writer in that I do love writing about, history primarily. I'm obsessed with history, as you all know. From the time I was a young child, history has always fascinated me, and trying to figure out what it goes back to. I think my parents, there was not a lot of pop culture in our house growing up. We would go to the Ashland Shakespeare Festival as our vacation every summer. So that everyone else got to go to the beach, and I went to go watch a bunch of Shakespeare plays, but I loved it actually because I didn't know any better. And I was 5 years old. We went to The Tempest and Taming of the Shrew. And then of course, Barbara, one thing that we share, and we always talk about when we're together is when it was not the summer and we were going to the Shakespeare Festival, we had season tickets to the Seattle Opera. My dad is an engineer. My mom's a housewife. So there was literally nothing else they spent money on. That was it. And my clothes came, I think, from the Sears catalog. But we did get to go to these wonderful, and it wasn't just that this wonderful storytelling was taking place in front of me. And I sort of, absorbed all these techniques for telling stories. And that's why I think if you read my books, I tend to not have as much exposition. I always want to be in a scene and to tell the story by what people are saying and doing instead of explaining, what's on a character's mind. I try to show what's on the character's mind. And that I think that all comes from watching all that sort of stage performance. But of course, the other element here is that it all takes place in a historical period. So I really lived in the past as a child, been fascinated by the past. And in my writing life, it's really that whole first half of the 20th century that fascinates me, and that sort of arc I like to talk about of, how we start out with this modernism bubbling up in in the decades before the First World War, and then you have this cataclysm, and then you have this search for meaning in the 1920s, and then the 30s you have the Depression, and you have the rise of ideologies like communism and fascism. And then you have the Second World War, and then you come to the Cold War, which has really obsessed me for the past few years. I think it kind of came about because when I stumbled on the story of the Cambridge spy ring, and that really sucked me in, because to me, that's what is fascinating about the Cold War is not this, but the spycraft is interesting, absolutely, and the cloak and dagger and the nail biting and the twists and turns, that's very exciting. But to me, what's really fascinating is like, what is it like to be a spy, or to live with a spy, or be the child of a spy, or be betrayed by a spy? What drives people, particularly these sort of deep cover agents who were spying for the Soviet Union, in the face of all this evidence that Stalin was just as brutal and, monstrous a tyrant as Hitler? How did they justify this to themselves? And why did they keep doing it? And how did they live with themselves? And so many of them became alcoholics, and, drawing their families into this, betraying their friends. That to me is really the fascinating bit, and but in tandem with all that fascination with history is my fascination with how people lived, in particular, sort of subcultures within our larger culture. That's kind of what the Summer Wives was about. This island, Fisher's Island in Long Island Sound, that is a bit like the Nantucket you never heard of, because the people on Fisher's Island are that sort of very discreet. The first rule of Fisher's Island is you don't talk about Fisher's Island. So generations come there, they stay in the same houses, they don't renovate. It's very bougie to renovate. You just you fix things up, and then you have these wealthy families, but you also have this year-round population that essentially sort of services the needs of the summer families in the summer, and then just sort of it lives on the island year-round. So I found that sort of there are all these class issues that are very sort of subtle, and money issues and ethnicity issues. A lot of the year-rounders come, are of Portuguese or Italian background, because they come from these fishing fleets. They were immigrants that came off these fishing fleets in the Mediterranean. So you have such a fascinating mix of cultures. So that was kind of what the Summer Wives was about. And then I went off and wrote books that were a little more sort of deep dive historical novels that weren't specifically set around summer. And when I kind of came around to writing this book, which was, I had this idea that came from this story I had read about this young woman who had, she was actually in England, suburban London, and this couple moved in down the street and befriended them, became kind of a mentor, took this girl, she's 15 years old, under her wing, and then MI5 turns up and says, actually, this couple is operating an illegal radio set transmitting information to the Soviet Union. So she has to betray this woman, and then comes back many years later to kind of get closure. And the woman is sort of like, I will never betray you, or sorry, I will never forgive you for betraying me. And, she's sort of like, well, gosh, that really wasn't the closure I was looking for. But in a way it is, because now she knows she did the right thing. And I found that story fascinating. I wanted to kind of turn that into a Beatrice book. But my editor was like, well, we kind of want you to write another one of those summer books that sort of sell really well, and have, a picture of a woman with a swimsuit on and the word summer in the title, and write one of those. So I said, well, what if I set my Cold War spy story on Winthrop Island from the Summer Wives? And so that's kind of how this all, I guess, came about. It's really the two halves of my writing personality coming together.
Wow. Well, there you have it. We hardly have.
And that's it. I think we can just, that's the topic.
It was really interesting for me to read it, because I am a child of the 50s. I was born in 1940. So it's interesting as you get old to discover that your life has become history. And the things that you live through are a foreign land to people, like Beatrice, for example, who's younger than I am. And I thought you captured the 50s very well. And there was that Eastern seaboard island with Martha's Vineyard or Nantucket or Fisher's Island or whatever, which is reflected, I might say, today in places like Aspen, where you have a winter culture, where you have the same thing, you have a year-round population, but then you have, the wealthy coming in for the season, which is for skiing. So
it's such a fascinating relationship.
But it's the same thing. And I remember reading several books set on Long Island in the 50s, where you had the potato farmers and the sort of ordinary people of Long Island suddenly being invaded by the wealthy who wanted to go to the Hamptons and then extend all that. So you definitely had those two classes. And it was often, I think, sad for the children of particularly the poorer class to think that maybe their childhood friends, they were all buddies, and then discovered that these class distinctions came
they're
up.
really living in two different worlds.
Yeah. And
I found it's such a fascinating relationship because on the one hand, they need each other. And it is part of the character of these summer families that you're very egalitarian, on the outside, and you're very, you're just one of the people, but you're really not, and you're not. And the parents are very aware of the class differences, but you don't talk about them because it's un-American to sort of have these class snobberies. But it's still there under the surface, and they do need each other. I mean, the year-rounders need, the money that comes in from the summer families, and that's what really is the economic lifeblood of, especially, and this is not the particular period in which this book takes place, but the lobster fishing, the fishing fleet there, it's just not as viable now as it used to be. In the 1920s, it was propped up by bootlegging. They would bring in not bootlegging, really, it was rum running. They would bring in the booze from sort of the motherships that were moored outside in international waters. So there was always sort of, the economic, they're sort of economically dependent. And of course, the summer families are dependent on these people to help them run these estates and keep everything up. So there is that. So there's so many little nuances to this relationship. And my goal, certainly with the Summer Wives, but also with this book, is to really kind of tease those out a bit. And in the spirit of the New England, way of doing things, you try not to really talk about it openly. You have to figure it out based on the way people are talking and behaving to each other, which is, a wonderful challenge to enact as a writer, is to communicate all that without directly communicating it.
Well, your books are always dialogue heavy, dialogue driven, as you say, you'd rather have people tell us through their own words rather than you describe it, which is fine. But, it's also true that the younger members of these families, it's more fluid for them, the social class thing. And so we have this young woman, Amelia, who can have a relationship with the two sons of the rich family. And, when they're young, it's all okay. And it becomes more challenging as they get older. But, Beatrice, I did 14 author events last week between Monday and Sunday. Can you believe
my
it?
goodness, you must be exhausted.
No, it's all very interesting, but a surprising number of them have had to do with spies. It's just, summer of spies, we call it every year. Wow. And one of the questions that we've been addressing is what has driven people to do this? Why is it that anybody would volunteer to become an asset, or not volunteer, but what would lure them into becoming an asset for another intelligence country? And, there are all kinds of motives. I mean, the most basic may be just money. I mean, we've seen it here.
There's the famous acronym, MICE. So money, ideology, conscience, which is not quite the same as ideology. It's more like, well, my country's doing something wrong, and therefore I have to betray my country. Or ego, which to me is, it's kind of there in all of them. I think one of the driving motivations for spies is just the feeling that you're kind of a little bit smarter than the people around you, and the need to kind of have one up on others. There's definitely a narcissism thread that goes through all spies. And I think, it's Kim Philby, for example. I mean, he paid a lot of lip service to the ideology, but really it was about, he just really loved playing the game, I think. And the ideology was his own self-justification for what he was doing.
Well, I think that was true of the whole Cambridge Five thing. I mean, Cambridge was always considered more the quote egghead university than Oxford. And I think, there was certainly a degree of narcissism showing off, having a secret.
And these guys were not from the top social class. So they sort of felt like, they weren't the sons of earls. They were more like the sons of MPs or the sons of, prosperous businessmen. So they didn't feel like they had the stature necessarily they deserved, even though they were privileged young men going to Cambridge. They still sort of felt like, well, this system's rigged, and why should this dimwit, son of an earl have more stature than I have? And, I think that was definitely part of it. Kim Philby definitely had this inferiority complex that narcissists tend to have. Actually, there's a sense of feeling inferior, and if you have to, that you're not getting, what you deserve, that you are in an inferior place that you don't deserve. And
it allows you to feel superior to other people because you have this glorious secret. That's a big part of it. I do think in the 20s and 30s, ideology was stronger. I think communism was an ideology. Certainly, fascism wasn't really an ideology, but communism, well, it was in a way, but really communism was. And I think there were people who actually were motivated by ideology, maybe in the same way that we're seeing religious faith, with the Islamists.
And so similarities with religious faith are very,
but today it seems to me that more and more it's just about money. But there's a new factor that's entered in, and it goes with this id or ego, whatever you want to call it. But this Texera or whatever his name is, kid that decided, he could show off publicly, kind of like Trump in the documents. Look, I have something, that is really secret and nifty, and I'm showing it off.
Yes.
And so I think that's a little different because it's not the secretness, it's now more of an open show off. And
well, one of the things that struck me about Donald McLean, who's the Cambridge spy that I based my character Sasha Digby on in Our Women in Moscow, was that when, way back in the beginning of his career, and this was right at the start of the Second World War, and he's he's in Paris, he's working for the Foreign Office. So he's at the embassy in Paris, and he meets this young American girl who he's very into, but she's not into him. So he's like, oh, but I'm not actually the boring diplomat I appear to be. I'm actually a Soviet spy. And then she's like, okay. And, and then sleeps with him and ends up marrying him. But it was not until, it was sort of like he had to show her how special he was. And he was more than happy, to do that. He just flat out told her. And, who does that? But that's because that's one of the reasons why he was a spy, because he did want to feel special and not just like he was leading just an ordinary life of a UK bureaucrat.
Well, now that we have the internet and social media, it gives people a lot more places to tell their stories and show off than they had before.
Yeah.
And I think
human nature writ large, isn't it?
Yeah. So I think that we'll see more of that. But let's go back here. We're back in 1946, losing track.
Yes, it is 1946. It is
right. So it's summer of 1946, June in point of fact. And you can set the scene, and then Olive arrives, and Olive is the pivot sort of this story.
Yes. So so Olive is the aunt of the young man the war has ended, and I particularly wanted to examine this moment because we have this moment where we've just defeated Hitler. We've just defeated this murderous tyranny. And we're thinking now we can take a break, it's all over, we can go back to normal. But of course, in order to defeat Hitler, we have to ally ourselves with Stalin, who is, pretty monstrous himself. And in the course of being Stalin's ally, we have given away a lot of our secrets, both intentionally and unintentionally through the Cambridge spy ring, who are able to get in there because of the close relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Second World War. So 1946 is a great turning point moment. Everyone's come home from the war, but we haven't yet realized that we are about to embark on another war that's going to last a lot longer and be a lot more murky and complicated and morally complicated, as well as strategically complicated, because we don't know how to fight this war. The Soviet Union is much better equipped to fight a spy war than we are at this point, because it's just like in the Russian DNA. They're one of the earliest spy services of all. They do it really, really well. And so there was that kind of moment of innocence and not really realizing what lay ahead. And so into this gap comes Olive Rutherford, and she has been living in Europe during the Second World War. She is the aunt of the Peabody boys. So the Peabody estate is the estate that Amelia Winthrop, as you might imagine from her name, she's the she's the descendant of one of the original English settlers on Winthrop Island. I chose that name deliberately because, in fact, the original Winthrops, John Winthrop Jr. was the first governor of Connecticut. When it was still a colony, and did in fact own land on Winthrop Island. So I kind of decided to name it Winthrop Island for that reason. Amelia Winthrop is the daughter of, one of the original Winthrops on the island. But of course, the Summer families have long since, these wealthy New England families have bought the farmland. And her father is now just a caretaker for the estate of the Peabody family. And the Peabodys had 3 sons. One is killed in the war. To return. Amelia herself has a brother who was killed in the war. So when everybody comes back on the island in 1946, the summer of 1946, Amelia is really hoping that now life can go back to normal. She can pick up the threads of this romance that was just kind of starting with one of the Peabody boys, and then along comes Olive Rutherford as well. And she comes to stay in the guest house at the Peabody estate and really takes Amelia under her wing. Amelia's mother is incapacitated. She had a stroke shortly after her son was killed, when she got the news that her son was killed. So Amelia's been taking care of her mother, and her future is to take care of her mother. That's what her family and her culture envisions for her. But Amelia is ambitious. She's smart. She wants to get off the island. It's very difficult for her. So, all of this is going on. And then we get an old friend from our woman in Moscow, an FBI agent named Sumner Fox turns up on Winthrop Island and needs to enlist Amelia's help because there is a spy transmitting vital information from Winthrop Island, from the Peabody estate itself to the Soviet spy services. So Amelia is enlisted to help capture this spy. And then we go back and forth between 1946 and then 1954, when Amelia has to face the repercussions of the tragedy and turmoil that occurred as a result of her actions that summer.
Right. And, there's a price to pay for everything we do, whether, whether we intend it well or whether we don't. And I think it would be hard not to have the reader, as well as Amelia, know how everything comes out. You can't just leave it. You could actually just.
Well, it is, to me, that's so fascinating because, and I'm sure as a fellow opera lover, one of the central conflicts in opera is the internal external conflict. So you have your loyalty to a person, either through love or family ties, and you're forced to make a choice between that loyalty and your loyalty to something larger, your country, or to your moral duty, or your religion. And that conflict will tear you apart, because how do you betray the people you love, the people who trust you, but you have to do it for a higher purpose. And it's such a fundamental human conflict. And to go through that at a young age and to have to make that choice, I think it's very, very, and it is a coming of age moment. And I specifically wanted to sort of have a person of that age go through this, because it's just something that changes you as a person. And we see Amelia in 1954 is a very different Amelia to the person we see in 1946. And you know, as you know, Barbara, my writing technique, I always write the earlier narrative first. So we go back and forth as you read it. But the way I write it is I will write everything that happened in 1946, usually right up until kind of as we get toward the climax. I'm not quite sure exactly how, you know, we're going to have this thing fall out. And then I turned to writing, you know, the other narrative, the later narrative. So in this case, 1954. And I really struggled a lot with Amelia as a youngster, because there are certain characters, it's hard to get into their heads. And I think maybe it was because she's so young, she doesn't really know herself yet. She doesn't know really what she wants. And then in 1954, this embittered but more confident Amelia emerges. And I found that interesting because, you know, you always have that core of yourself, even, you know, when you're younger. So that really helped me understand the earlier Amelia a lot better. And that's when I really kind of got going with this and really, you know, went back and worked again in 1946 and really understood Amelia a lot better as I went through and kind of revised a bit.
Well, Olive had already made a choice.
Yes.
You know, so it isn't like Amelia is the only one that has decided that, you know, personal relationships and loyalties may not be as transcendent as,
Yes,
you know, larger loyalties. Although, you know, I'm not sure I was ever 100% into whatever drove Olive. Were you 100% into what drove Olive?
So here's what's interesting to me about spies who are primarily driven by ideology. And by the way, female spies tend to be much more driven by ideology than male spies. It's less of a money and an ego thing and more of but what happens is once you make that choice, devote yourself to an ideology, you can't go back. You have to believe in it. And it is a very religious moment where, you know, we on the outside can see, say, the Puritans and say, you know, gosh, you guys, you know, why were you so strict in believing in certain things against all evidence to the contrary? Well, that is essentially what happens with these people who are so ideologically attached to communism that they will find any justification. We know that Stalin was a monster. The purges in the 1930s were monstrous. You know, the reason why, you know, he struck the pact with Hitler was because he had purged 90% of his officers. I mean, he had no you know, capable people in charge of his army at that point. So, you know, and the paranoia and neighbors reporting on neighbors, you know, family members reporting on each other, you know, so, but how do you in order to justify that, you have to commit yourself fully to an ideology in a religious sense that you will turn away from any evidence to the contrary, any evidence that it's not working. And that's why Stalin found it so easy. He called them, you know, his useful idiots in the 1930s, the Western intellectuals who would come over and they would see his propaganda and his model farms and be like, oh, it's the wave of the future. This is so beautiful. And they don't, you know, and you know, they would literally say these things, you know, in order to get to the wheat, you have to, you know, get rid of the chaff, you know, and all these things. We're talking about people, not wheat, you know, this is not, you know, but if you are so committed to something, to an ideology, these are the ways you will when it doesn't work, when it shows itself to be incapable of operating without a controlling force that is controlling the problem with communism is you need this 100% buy-in. You can't have 10% of the population say, well, I'm not going to do that, because then nothing works. So you have to have this 100% buy-in, and that requires a totalitarian government. And so when you have someone like these Westerners who committed themselves to spy for Stalin, they were never going to admit to themselves that they were wrong, because to admit that you were wrong is to accept responsibility for what Stalin did, and to be part of that, and to have contributed to that, to have delivered atomic secrets to Stalin, to give Stalin the bomb. It's pretty monstrous if unless communism really is the wave of the future. So you have to believe that.
Well, Spain was torn apart in the 1930s between communist and fascism, and there were still some loyalists to the monarchy, and it was kind of a preview of all that was to come. And gradually, communism does not work in any pure sense. It really is against human nature to think that, the basic idea that everybody indeed will be equal just doesn't fly.
It doesn't. You need a ruling class to. The problem is, I think human beings are eventually going to resist this idea that you have, having their thoughts controlled, having your first loyalty be to the state rather than the human beings around you, I think is something that is not human.
It isn't human. And the other problem, of course, is that the ruling class inevitably becomes corrupt because they live in a bubble, and they get used to power, and they get used to money. And, you can see it around celebrities. You can see it in operation. I've had this discussion many times over the last few years about how easy it is for people to develop a bubble, whether it's a tech millionaire or billionaire. I guess millionaires used to be a big thing, but now I guess if you're not a billionaire, it really doesn't count. But you do see that, and they get surrounded by people whose only power and whose income comes from catering to and keeping the life of the person above them going. And so they don't tell them inconvenient truths, which is exactly the reasons we're apparently have the war in the Ukraine, is that nobody really stood up to Putin and said, they're not going to just roll over.
Well, you saw, the author's note at the end of the Beach at Summerley, and I was sort of writing the edits as, the Russian tanks were rolling into to Eastern Ukraine. And to me, and the reports that we got back of the behavior of the Soviet army, the rapes, the murders, this is exactly what is happening in Eastern Europe at the end of World War II, as the Soviet army is sweeping over Eastern Europe. They're getting revenge for Stalingrad. They're getting revenge to the siege of Leningrad. The rape of women, in Berlin at the end of the war is for a long time, it wasn't even talked about. But it's, all this behavior that you're reading about in the news, these atrocities are exactly, but we essentially covered it up at the time, at the end of the Second World War, because Stalin's our ally. So we can't, crimes that in fact, the Soviet army had committed were blamed on, in which obviously this is not as if the Nazis have not made their own atrocities, but there was a massacre in Poland that took place that actually the Soviets were the ones who committed it. And for the longest time at Nuremberg, it was they put forward that the Nazis had committed this crime rather than in fact the Soviet troops. So it is a bit of a lot of chickens coming home to roost right now in Ukraine. And I honestly, in Putin, I see so many similarities, and I think that he would probably not admit it, but I think he feels that Stalin was a great leader for the Soviet Union. He certainly appears and projects himself as somebody who wants to rule as Stalin and would if he could. So, I guess we'll see.
Another small man. It's so interesting. Napoleon, Hitler, Putin, Stalin.
Well, it's
They were
not,
all, they were all small.
yeah, it's, it's not scientific, but who knows what, I mean, what drives these guys, I think what we should never forget is that, Putin grew up in the KGB, and that was
Yeah.
that was, how he was trained.
He
And
was a Stasi. There was an interesting piece, I think, in the New York Times the other day that, or maybe it was the Wall Street Journal, one or the other. Anyway, they had a reproduction of his Stasi credential and a photograph
I
of
saw
him
that.
as very, very young. And you could
I
see,
mean, yeah, it's that the Stasi really took that whole police state to new levels, and it's, I think we forget, that when the Berlin Wall came down, it was a cause for celebration. I mean, people had died trying to get out
right.
of Eastern Europe for so long, and there was a reason for that. And I think it's important not to forget that, but also to remember that, people stayed committed to it because they couldn't, admit themselves to be wrong. And for Olive, turning back to the story, I mean, I think that she said, we see a lot where she sees a lot of herself in Amelia as someone who wants to break out of her, I guess, ordained role in society, because even Olive, even though she belongs to, a more privileged class, she's got her life kind of set out for her, and it does not include, traveling the world and getting herself involved in politics and spying. So she sees Amelia, who wants to break out of the role that is expected of her, the class that is expected of her. And she sees something of herself. And, and I don't want to give any of the book away, but, I certainly think she wants Amelia to be her protege. She wants to take on Amelia as a protege, because that in some ways is the ultimate justification that she is right.
Mm-hmm. Very well said. So do you see yourself writing these characters again?
So in fact, the book that I have out next summer, which I've just finished, takes place again. We're back on Winthrop Island, but actually in the present day, mostly. There is a narrative that takes place, some grandparents, their story in Cairo in 1951 to 52 during the riots that took place there against British influence. It wasn't really rule at that point. It was a British influence in the Suez. And so there's that narrative, but the primary narrative takes place in Winthrop Island in the present day, kind of bouncing between 2008 and summer of 2022. And so we do actually, Amelia actually appears as, I think, a 97 or 8-year-old in this book. And so we kind of close a few loops with her. And some of the families that we see, and a few of the family references, we sort of revisit a couple of characters from the Summer Wives. You don't have to have read the Summer Wives to read this, but if you have read, you'd be like, oh, the Monk family and Benjamin Monk. Oh yeah, he was the one who was shot down over Europe. And in fact, he's mentioned in this book that's set in modern day because of this tradition to name, male children in the family after Benjamin Monk, who died. So my main character is actually a monk. His mother is a monk, and his full name is Benjamin Monk, but everyone calls him Monk. His father was a different family, so his last name is not Monk, but his first name is Monk. So so all these little, I like to call them like little Easter eggs that I put in there for my longtime readers. So you don't have to have read my earlier books to understand what's going on. But if you have, you'll notice these little references to characters and families that you've seen before. And I love to put those in there.
Well, I think your storytelling lends itself to generations. It's kind of.
I love it so much. I love revisiting generations because sometimes I leave things a little ambiguous. At the end of Our Women in Moscow, we don't really find out what happens to Sasha Digby. We don't find out what happens to Sumner Fox. Is Ruth, we know he's been found brutally, hurt, but we don't really know because, what really happens with him. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to put him in this book, so that we could, learn a little more about him and what happened. So we see Sumner actually in 1946, which is before the events of Our Women in Moscow, and then we see him in 1954, which is after the events of Our Women in Moscow. So kind of fully sort of closes that loop.
So what's going on with the 3 Ws?
Yeah, we finished another book.
Yay.
Barbara, you're in this book.
Am I really?
Yes, you
What
appear
is
in a
the book
cameo
called?
at the end of this book. So that's all I'm going to say about it. That's something that no one else knew. That is a world exclusive you're getting
Whoa.
right now. For all of you taking the time to watch. So that is a clue about the next Billy White Williams book that will be out September of 2024. And interestingly, this book as well takes place mostly in the modern day. In Scotland, we have let that tidbit out. It takes place in Scotland in the modern day, and 3 characters, and it all takes place at the same time, which was a really fun challenge for us because our characters are appearing in each other's chapters. So I get to write Karen and Lauren's characters through the viewpoint of my character. And we had so much fun writing this book. When Lauren's husband saw the outline come off the printer, he read it and said, "This is comic genius," So it is a really fun book. There's a murder involved. It's in Scotland in the present day. And of course, so Barbara gets a cameo at the end of the book. So we'll make sure you get an early copy so you can approve your portrayal.
Oh no, I don't want any approval. If I'm there, I'm there. Just take a chance and see what comes out. I love it. No, I thought it was
So
great.
we will definitely be there in person for the book tour in September. We will be at the Poison Pen. It'll be in September, so hopefully things that won't be quite as brutally hot as in end of June.
Oh, I hope not either. Now, just to be clear, this is not this September. It's
No, sorry, September of 2024.
Right. I don't want to be
Yes.
rushing along.
Yes, the
Actually, your
publishing
publicist has
journalism.
already asked me to hold a couple of dates for it. So this is how the publishing world is going now. That right.
We don't want to lose our window. I know. I wish I knew. Unfortunately, we don't have an exact pub date, but I think end of September 2024 is kind of the window that they are looking at right now.
They'll certainly allow for it. I mean, who could resist actually hosting an event in which
I know it's so
meta. Patrick, why don't you pop in and join us and tell us if we have any questions or comments or anything you might like to say.
First of all, it's very exciting about your cameo. That's really cool.
Yeah. May not be so exciting when I read it. We'll find out.
You got another cameo.
No, it's really
too.
fun. It's really fun, actually.
Oh, it'll be great. We just had a whole chapter in a James Patterson book, which he described me as,
awesome.
What was I, small and blonde and wearing red. So when I did his book launch, I had to find something, red.
You had to find some red to wear.
To wear, but he did not. He did go to a restaurant in the chapter, but not our restaurant, but rather the restaurant next door. So obviously wasn't quite as tuned in as you are.
Let's
see, what do we have here? Okay, yeah.
That's what I love about these discussions with you, Barbara. I feel like we get into, we kind of deep dive into some of these topics, which is so much fun.
Well, it really has been interesting. I don't know if you saw The Peacock and the Scorpion, for example, a new spy novel. Joe Cannon and I did an event for her. Matthew Quirk was here with a new book. William Maas, who has a Romanian spy story. Summer usually does bring out quite a few spy stories. And with Russia resurgent, these questions have come up every time.
Yes.
What motivates people, to betray their country, or, as you say, the mice thing. It's been a big question. And what's interesting is it's in different cultures. Yeah. Like one of them is in Bahrain and one of them is in Bucharest, and it's not all the same.
This whole idea of the deep cover agent is something that the Soviets could do here, because we have an open society. It's virtually impossible for, a Western liberal democracy to have an effective deep cover agent
Right.
in a police state, because everyone's suspicious of each other to begin with. I mean, I finally watched The Americans. Everyone told me when I was doing the book tour for Such as It Was, for Our Women in Moscow, that you must have watched The Americans. And I the reason I can write so many books is because I really don't watch a lot of TV, but I did finally watch it. And which is obviously brilliantly written. I loved it so much. But the reason you can get away with it is because nobody would suspect, I mean, in a million years, that your next door neighbor was a KGB spy. I mean, come on, right? Like, even the FBI agent next door doesn't suspect it. So, you can get away with that in a Western liberal democracy. You could never do it in a police state like communist Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Union, because the level of paranoia is already high, and it's just not going to work.
Patrick, any questions?
Oh, we can't hear you.
Yes, I
There we
muted
go.
myself. Sorry about that. Let's see. There are a number of questions. Renee would
Okay.
like to know, do you have a restaurant at the PP? It kind of sounded like we did, but
Oh,
we don't-
sorry. No, it's a neighboring restaurant. And part of the experience for authors coming to the Poison Pen is meeting up for dinner or brunch or whatever we can do. And there is a restaurant near us where I almost always take everybody. And that's we think of it as kind of like part of the bookstore, but
The corporate cafeteria.
yeah, it's actually not. It's called Virtue, and it's a wonderful restaurant. And I've spent, they just had their 10th anniversary, and we have been going there for 10 solid years. So, it does really feel like you've been there with me, Beatrice.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or Zaza at the Valley Ho, which is my favorite hotel. And this is one of the reasons why we keep coming back to you for book tours. I just love staying at that hotel.
You know what? That's true, but you will have a surprise. They have really gone after the millennial crowd. And
It's gotten to be a bit of a party scene.
yes,
I know.
it's a very heavy party scene now. So
Yeah.
some
There was-
authors have not been quite as comfortable at the
I like to
festival as
chill
they-
by the pool. I don't want to, the whole thing. But I do have my T-shirt that says Valley Ho on it. So
Good.
my husband loves it when I wear that.
Excellent. Anyway, no, I wish we did have a restaurant but we don't have enough parking. The city would not let us have a restaurant, and we are surrounded by any number of restaurants.
You do
So,
have a lot of restaurants around you. Yes.
yeah, we do. We're the whole rest of the block essentially, except for a few condos is restaurants, and then Arcadia Farms is there, and all kinds of other stuff. So people bring food in, or they come and save their seats and dash out. So it hasn't been a huge drawback, but sure, I would love it if we had a restaurant inside the store, but there just isn't any way to do it.
Because there would never be any reason to leave.
That's true. Then we could have sleepovers at the Poison Pen. That would be
Oh my
cool.
gosh, locked in at the Poison Pen.
That's
That
right.
would be-
Sounds like a book title. It'd be great. I guess we could actually do that. We could probably do that. Camping. It would be more like camping. Anyway,
S'mores.
sorry, Patrick, carry on.
Okay, anyway, any more questions?
Let's see. What do we have here? Okay, so what 3 books are you currently reading or plan on reading soon?
Ah,
And who are
This is putting me on the spot.
who are a few of your current favorites?
Oh gosh. So the deal is the spring is a bad time to ask me that question, because I'm usually getting ready to put a book out, and also simultaneously frantically working on deadline to finish up the book that will be out the following year. So I have to admit that at the present time, I am mostly reading research and sort of preview copies of books of authors that Most of them I usually know, but sometimes some new ones. So I'll throw two books. Well, I'll throw you an author. You know, if you're interested in the story behind the story with Cold War spies, I think any of the Ben McIntyre books would be terrific. And I got a lot of the character of Olive Rutherford out of his book Red Sonja, which was about a famous woman she was actually German. And she was Klaus Fuchs's contact. So he was a physicist working for the Manhattan Project, who was actually a Soviet spy, and she was his go-between. So she was, but she was, I think, Olive's a little bit darker than this woman was, and but. That being said, you know, it's just such a fascinating window into that world. And if you're really into it, and you want to know the real stories of the spies, and he's written books on the Cambridge spies, obviously, and some other sort of related topics. So Ben McIntyre is great if you want to explore sort of the nonfiction side of it. And then the book so I reviewed this book for the New York Times, and it was such a surprise for me because so they contact you about reviewing, and they want to make sure that you don't know this person that you're reviewing who's written the book, or that you don't know the editor or the agent. So she said, "Do you know Susanna Hoffs?" And I'm like, "No," you know, and then I'm like, weird. And after I said yes, you know, I'm happy to review this. Then I guess there's something like, it is really familiar. I should Google her and make sure I didn't run into her at a writer conference somewhere, and I would know her book, right? So I Googled her, and then I realized why her name is so familiar. She was the lead singer of the Bangles, like Manic Monday, Walk Like an I know, right? And instantly my husband starts freaking out because he literally had a poster of Susanna Hoffs like on his wall as a teenager. And I'm like, well, I don't know, does that disqualify me? But no, because it's not a personal contact. So I'm thinking, okay, and I was like, I hate to write a bad review because I'm a pleaser. So, I would tell my honest opinion, but I'm always hoping the book is going to be something I really like. And so I get the book, and I'm like, okay, please, let her actually, or at least if she's ghostwriting it, let whoever ghostwrite. It is so good. It's not ghostwritten. She's just a smart, funny kind of person you would love to go out to dinner with. You can just tell this from the writing. It's a love story. And the great thing is she hasn't like grown up in the writing culture where it's like, oh, these are the rules, you can't do this, you can't do that. She just goes for it. It is such a fun book. It's called This Bird Has Flown. So there's a love story, but it's also about a singer. And so you get this eye into the music world. And she has great writing chops. She has a great way with language, and she's smart. And there's all these little allusions in there. And I'm not even, to be honest, like I don't, I just, the way I grew up, I don't have a lot of background in pop music. So a lot of the references just went whoosh right over my head, but I still, kind of like the Patrick O'Brian novels, I've never sailed a ship. And yet somehow I get everything that's in those books, even though, it's still accessible. So I loved that book so much. Susanna Hoffs, This Bird Has Flown. And I said so in my review. And so that was really, and again, I haven't been able to read a lot of fiction ever since because I was frantically trying to finish up my book now. But I guess there's some wonderful go-to. Obviously, any Karen White or Lauren Willig book is going to be amazing. And there's so many great other writers of historical fiction out there, who have books out right now. Fiona Davis has a new book out, The Spectacular. And Marie Benedict has a new book out with her co-author. And it's about this relationship between Eleanor Roosevelt and this woman who was really kind of one of the pioneers of civil rights. And they had this wonderful friendship, and it's a great, great book. So those are kind of the books that I, were kind of been on my radar screen. But summer is actually the time when, once I'm done with my book tour and my book is turned in, I can sit back and read for pleasure again, at least for a few precious months. So actually, what I want is all your reading recommendations. You tell me, what are the great books I should be reading, and not just the ones that are like the hot book of the moment, but ones that are actually really good. So I would like your recommendations. So,
Well, we started an historical fiction paperback club because a lot of historical fiction is now actually coming out as paperback originals in this kind of thing of publishing, and therefore sometimes people miss them. So I can say, what's it called, Patrick? The ill-mannered. I can't type, unfortunately, so I'm going to have a hard time looking up. But there were a couple. Claudia Gray has written The Murder of Mr. Wickham and the whatever it is of, anyway, they're two Jane Austen-y kind of things that are very good. The ill-mannered, gosh, I wish Allison Goodwin is the author's name. Allison.
oh
Goodwin.
yes, yeah, I've heard of this one. I've
It's,
heard
it's a lot of fun. It again is Regency. I think that the Bridgerton effect has created more, more interest in.
I'm waiting for Fanny Burney to get revived. I actually did my honors thesis in college on Fanny Burney.
It would be.
I'm waiting for a Fanny Burney comeback. So she was, she inspired. There wouldn't be a Jane Austen without Fanny Burney. And she had a fascinating life story as well. So.
Or Maria Edgeworth, you could write.
Yes, yes.
Another novelist.
All the stuff I read in college.
That era would be kind of interesting too. Anyway, there's I think her name is Diana Hillier or Billier, wrote a wonderful book set in Vienna, right at the end of the 19th century, name of which has gone out of my head, but that was terrific. So unfortunately, my mind is a soup of forgotten titles because I read so much that it's hard for me to keep them up. But
the Benevolent Society of Ill-Mannered Ladies.
That's it.
Allison Goodman.
Yeah, the Benevolent Society of Ill-Mannered Ladies is really a lot of fun. And
somebody's recommending Demon Copperhead.
Demon Copperhead.
Oh yes, I've heard good things about that one too. So what I need to do when I'm going to bookstores is just try and find a couple of good things for me to read once I am done with tour, and I can sit back and recharge my creative batteries again.
Gotcha. I'll send you a list because it'll be easier that way, all the way around. Was that it, Patrick?
Well, anything happening with Summer Wives as a film?
Yeah. Never ask, okay? Unless the baby is coming out, you don't ask if the woman is pregnant, okay? No, so we did have a that was optioned. It is not a currently active project. Let's put it that way.
There's no baby bump.
But I'm still a WGA member, so I'm technically on strike right now. I just want you to
know. Just a few more here. Let's see. What?
I can't write any screenplays right now. Sorry. No, I can't write any screenplays.
What has been your favorite time period to write about? And do you have a favorite character of all the characters you've written?
My favorite time period tends to be the one that I'm writing about now. I mean, I think that I'm really deeply interested in those early years of the Cold War and that transition from how we fought one war to how we learned to fight another one, and why and how it came about. And I'm just deeply fascinated. And it's not so much the spy stuff itself. It's kind of like the next layer underneath that of what it's like to live as a human being during this period of transition. So that's kind of where I am right now. But, there's definitely a lot of periods that interest me. And I mean, I can't sort of give you my whole list of story ideas right now because it's pretty varied. But, I will say favorite characters. So I do love writing the Wicked City books. Those are, and bringing Jen Kelly to life. I think she's absolutely, if not my favorite, certainly, one of my absolute favorite characters I've ever written. I think the one, her last flight to me was And this was a book that came out during COVID. So there was really no kind of, bookstores were closed. There was really no marketing going on for that book. A lot of people, it's just not on their radar screens. But at the time that I wrote it and put it out, I really felt that it was the strongest book that I had written, and that the main character was, I felt, a lot of times you finish a book and you're not quite sure if you quite accomplished what you wanted to do with this book. And did you really? When I finished writing Her Last Flight, I was like, this was the book. This was exactly the book I wanted to write. And this character was realized, and exactly, not that I knew how she was going to be when I started writing it, but the way everything was realized, to me, I just felt this enormous satisfaction that she had been through a particular kind of trauma in her life. And I felt that I had kind of nailed her arc, I guess. And as we say in the business, and so, that always has a special place in my heart, because I feel like it's a bit my sort of unloved stepchild, because nobody knew when it came out. It just didn't, so if there's one book that if you haven't read any of my books, you're trying to hook somebody, I just want, Her Last Flight to be that book that you recommend, because to me, it is really maybe my most fully realized book, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Well, thank you for letting us know. We will certainly do that. Absolutely.
I think that is about it. A few more recommendations for you, but
oh, yay. Well, you know what? Just send those on to me. Just, if you can just email it to me, that'd be great. Because I could use a few good reads now,
It's always fun to talk about other books while we're talking about your book.
I know, but that's part of it. I think you can't, you cannot, you cannot keep writing unless you refresh the will. And actually, and because so much historical fiction crosses my desk because of just being in that world. And so I read a lot of those books because my friends are writing them, or because I'm previewing them, writing blurbs and so on. I actually, for pleasure, I like to kind of go out of my genre a bit. I like to read some contemporary stuff, some literary stuff, some mystery, to really kind of, that is really what refreshes me, because that way I'm not, I'm truly writing something that is not, I try not to write anything that's derivative of anything else. And sometimes it just happens coincidentally, because we all have spies on our minds, for example, for whatever reason.
It is fiction, but I'm going to recommend Lady Tan and Her Circle of Women. It's absolutely brilliant. Lisa C's new book. And
Lisa C is terrific. Yes.
There are elements of Snowflower and the Secret Fan in it, but the woman character in it is truly remarkable. So
definitely. And that's definitely on my list. Yeah. I love Lisa C is terrific.
I think she is too. And this is 16, mostly 15th century, maybe 16th century China, but it's great. Anyway, thank you, Beatrice, very much. I know it's late where you are.
Thank you. I know. I got to get to bed. I'm in that early stage of book tour where it's like, and this is my literal third event of the day. So I do need my sleep. I probably, look like I need my sleep. But and then I've got, some stuff. I'm going around the South right now. Just me and my rental car.
Right. Well,
my
I hope you enjoy it.
Bookmarks.
So today was your publication day. So here we are on Wednesday. But anyway, felicitations on yet another wonderful book. I hope you enjoy book tour.
Wait to return to Arizona as soon as possible. Certainly, if not with my standalone. I don't know if you can take two of me in a short period of time, because that book will be out next summer, and then in September we'll be in for the Beatriz Williams. But hey, I'm ready to pack my bags whenever you want me. So
I'd love to have you separately. It's different when you're with the other two W's. So
it's a different dynamic, definitely.
Anyway, thank you all
a very
for
good
show. Don't forget, as I said, we have autographed copies for those of you not on the East Coast, where you
they're all signed and ready to be read.
Right. Indeed they are. So thanks very much, everybody. And let me wish you, since we're signing off, other than one event tomorrow night, a very happy 4th of July weekend when you would luck.